story, he called 911, but what police found was beyond imagination. He called 911 with trembling hands, his voice broken and scattered like shards of glass. The operator on the other end could barely understand him through the heavy breaths and muffled sobs. "Please, you have to come. It's not what it looks like, I swear, please just come." Those words marked the beginning of a night that would shake an entire town to its core, and forever change the lives of everyone involved. At first, the call seemed like just another emergency, the kind that dispatchers handled every single day. But what police officers found when they arrived at the scene was something no one could have imagined in the darkest nightmares. The man on the phone was David Miller, a 34-year-old mechanic who lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Springfield. David was known to his neighbors as a hard-working, quiet man. He fixed cars during the day, and in the evenings, he often sat on his porch drinking iced tea, watching kids play in the street. People described him as polite, maybe a little withdrawn, but never dangerous. Yet on that rainy Tuesday night, when the sound of sirens grew louder and blue lights flashed across the wet pavement, David stood outside his house drenched in sweat and rain, his eyes wide with terror, his hands covered in something dark and sticky. When the police approached, he raised his hands in surrender. "It's inside," he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. "I didn't do this, I didn't." The officers, trained to expect the unexpected, drew their weapons and moved toward the door. Nothing could have prepared them for the sight that awaited inside. The living room looked ordinary at first glance, a worn-out couch, an old television set, a coffee table with magazines scattered across it. But the air smelled of iron, sharp and unmistakable. There, on the carpet, lay two bodies, one of them a woman in her late 20s, her face pale, her eyes lifeless and staring at the ceiling. The other, a young boy, no older than 6, curled up beside her as if he had fallen asleep. Except he wasn't sleeping. The officers froze, the silence of the house pressing down on them. One officer muttered into his radio for backup, while the other stepped closer, scanning the room for any signs of life. But there was none. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling bore faint stains, splatters that told a silent story of violence. It was clear that whatever had happened here wasn't quick or clean. It was brutal, and yet, there was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no smashed locks. It looked as though the killer had walked right in, or worse, had already been inside. David, still outside, kept repeating the same words, "I didn't do this, I swear to God I didn't do this." His cries pierced the night, drawing curious neighbors out of their homes. Some gasped at the flashing lights and whispered rumors among themselves. Others covered their children's eyes and ushered them back inside. Nobody could understand what was happening, and nobody wanted to believe that the quiet man from down the street could be capable of such horror. The police handcuffed David and placed him in the back of a cruiser while detectives arrived at the scene. Questions flew fast and sharp. Who were the victims? What was their connection to David? Was this a robbery gone wrong, or something far darker? As investigators combed through the house, they began piecing together fragments of a life that had been hidden from view. The woman was identified as Sarah Mitchell, a local waitress who had been reported missing earlier that week. The boy was her son, Ethan. They had vanished without a trace after leaving her sister's house 3 nights ago. Flyers with their faces had been taped to telephone poles all around town. And now, here they were, in David Miller's living room. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. People gathered at the police station demanding answers. How could Sarah and Ethan have ended up in David's house? Why hadn't anyone seen them enter? And most importantly, who was responsible for the deaths? David maintained his innocence from the moment he was arrested. He claimed he had come home from work late that night to find his front door unlocked. When he stepped inside, he saw the bodies and panicked. He swore he had no idea who they were or how they got there. But to investigators, his story sounded thin. His fingerprints were all over the house, And while he argued that of course his prints would be everywhere, he lived there, the sheer panic in his voice raised suspicion. As days turned into weeks, the investigation revealed haunting details. Security cameras from a nearby gas station showed Sarah and Ethan walking along the street the night they disappeared. Strangely, they seemed calm, as if heading somewhere they trusted. Witnesses reported seeing them near David's street, though no one could say for certain if they entered his house. What puzzled investigators most was the absence of any struggle inside the home. Sarah's body showed signs of being restrained, but there was no sign of forced resistance. It was almost as if she had gone willingly into that house, unaware of what awaited her. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that David and Sarah had been secretly involved, though no evidence supported that claim. Others speculated that David had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, that maybe Sarah was hiding from someone else, and his house had become the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth, however, remained elusive. David's family stood by him, insisting he was incapable of such violence. His mother wept on live television, begging the public not to judge her son before the facts were clear. But the weight of public opinion was heavy, and the image of a mechanic with blood-stained hands standing outside his own home was hard to erase. Then, months into the investigation, a breakthrough came. Forensic experts analyzing the crime scene discovered traces of DNA that didn't belong to David, Sarah, or Ethan. It belonged to someone else entirely, a man with a violent history who had recently been released from prison. His name was Jacob Harris, and he had once lived just a few blocks away from David. Jacob was known for his temper, for getting into fights, and for disappearing for weeks at a time. The revelation shifted the entire case. Suddenly, David was no longer the prime suspect. He was a man who had stumbled upon a nightmare staged in his own home. But how had Jacob Harris gotten in? And why would he leave the bodies there? Investigators dug deeper and uncovered a chilling truth. Jacob had been watching Sarah for weeks, following her without her knowledge. On the night she disappeared, he lured her with promises of safety, convincing her to trust him. When she resisted, he dragged her to David's house, a house he knew would make the perfect cover, because Jacob had once worked there years ago as a handyman. He knew the layout, the locks, the back entrance that few people noticed. By leaving the bodies in David's home, he ensured that suspicion would fall on the innocent man who lived there. When the truth came out, the community was stunned. David was released from custody, but the damage to his life was irreversible. His name had been dragged through the mud, his reputation shattered. People who once waved to him across the street now avoided his gaze. He had lost his job, his friends, and even his sense of safety in his own home. The real killer was eventually captured, but the scars remained, not just for David, but for the entire town. And yet, through the pain and loss, something powerful emerged. David refused to let his story end in bitterness. He spoke openly about his ordeal, warning others of the dangers of assumptions and snap judgments. He reminded people that sometimes the truth is far more complicated than what we first see. His strength inspired others who had been falsely accused or unfairly judged. Slowly, people began to rally around him, offering apologies, support, and a chance to rebuild. In the end, the story wasn't just about tragedy or crime. It was about resilience, about the way one man stood up against a tide of suspicion and hate, and found a way to move forward. It was about the reminder that behind every headline, behind every whispered rumor, there are real lives, real hearts, and real pain. And above all, it was about hope, that even in the darkest moments, truth can shine through, and justice, though delayed, can still prevail. After his release, David didn't walk out of jail like a free man. He walked out carrying a weight that felt heavier than any chain the system could have put on him. Reporters crowded the entrance, flashing cameras and shouting questions that cut like blades. Some shouted, "Did you really kill them?" Others demanded, "How did their bodies end up in your house?" Though evidence had cleared his name, suspicion still clung to him like smoke after a fire. He tried to return to his small home, but even there, silence screamed louder than anything else. The once comfortable living room where he used to rest after work was now a memory of horror. He couldn't bear to sit on the couch, couldn't walk across the floor without remembering where the bodies had been found. Every creak of the wood, every shadow cast by the streetlight outside, dragged him back into that night. Neighbors kept the distance. Some crossed the street when he walked by. A few brave ones offered him a nod, but most stared with unease. Children who once asked him to fix their bikes now hid behind their parents. It was as though a wall had been built between him and the world, a wall made of fear, rumor, and mistrust. His mother remained his anchor. Every evening, she came to sit with him, cooking simple meals and speaking to him with the same gentleness she had when he was a child. "David," she would say, "you survived the storm. Now it's time to live again." But living again wasn't simple. He had lost his job at the auto shop. Customers no longer wanted to bring the cars to the man from the news. Bills piled up, and his savings ran thin. The town had freed him from jail, but not from judgment. Meanwhile, the trial of Jacob Harris began. In court, the full darkness of his crimes came to light. Testimonies revealed that Jacob had stalked women before, though no one had pieced it together until Sarah's murder. His obsession, his anger, his desire to control, all of it had led to that terrible night. He confessed in fragments, but even in his confessions, he twisted the truth, blaming Sarah, blaming society, blaming anyone but himself. For the families, it was unbearable. Sarah's sister broke down on the stand, her voice trembling as she spoke of Ethan, a little boy who would never again laugh or play. David sat in the courtroom every day, not because he had to, but because he needed to. He needed to see justice served for Sarah and Ethan. He needed to see the face of the man who had turned his life into a nightmare. And when the guilty verdict finally came, when the judge sentenced Jacob Harris to life without parole, the courtroom erupted in a mix of tears, relief, and rage. David sat silently, his fists clenched, tears slipping down his cheeks. Justice had come, but it did not erase the scars. After the trial, David began speaking publicly about his ordeal. At first, he was hesitant, stumbling over his words as he described the terror of being falsely accused. But soon, his story reached beyond Springfield. Journalists from bigger cities interviewed him, advocacy groups for the wrongly accused invited him to speak, and slowly, the image of the suspect was replaced by the survivor. He spoke about Sarah and Ethan too, making sure the names were never forgotten. His journey wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about healing, for himself and for the community. Over time, people who had once whispered behind his back began to apologize. Some admitted they had judged too quickly, others offered help in rebuilding his life. David never lashed out. He accepted their apologies, though he knew trust could never be the same again. One evening, nearly a year after his release, David stood on his porch once more. The air was warm, filled with the sound of children playing down the street. For the first time in months, one of the children waved at him. Hesitant, but genuine, David raised his hand in return, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. What police had found that night had been beyond imagination. But what followed was also beyond imagination. The resilience of a man crushed by false blame, the strength of a community learning to confront its fear, and the enduring reminder that truth, though buried, can still rise. In the end, David's life became a testimony, not just to tragedy, but to survival, not just to injustice, but to the power of redemption. His story carried a message that stretched beyond his small town: never rush to judgment, never assume the surface is the whole truth, and never forget that hope can survive even in the darkest places. In the quiet of a late summer night, long after the crowds and cameras had gone, David sat alone on his porch, the same place where so much of his life had once felt ordinary. He thought about Sarah and Ethan, lives stolen too soon, and about the months he had spent living under a shadow not of his own making. He knew nothing would ever erase those memories, but he also knew he had survived something few people could understand. He looked up at the stars, the same sky that Sarah and Ethan must have once looked at, and whispered a silent promise, to live for them, to honor them by never letting fear or bitterness define his days. In the stillness, he realized that though the past had nearly destroyed him, it had also given him something unexpected, a purpose. A reason to keep going. David's story was no longer just about a night of horror. It had become about resilience, about holding on to hope when the world turns against you, and about finding light after unimaginable darkness. Answer: as the street grew quiet and the world moved on, David finally stood, walked inside, and closed the door, not to shut out the world, but to open himself to a new beginning. Because in the end, truth had saved him. And truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way. Message. This story is a reminder that truth, though delayed, can never be destroyed. In a world where rumors spread faster than facts, and judgments are made in seconds, we must remember that behind every headline, every whisper, there is a human being with a life, a family, and a heart that feels. David's struggle shows us that strength is not in avoiding pain.